What we need, and you said it absolutely right, is a Democratic Party that's ready to meet this moment. A Democratic Party leadership that is not just angry, but that understands the stakes.
State Rep Malcolm Kenyatta recently was elected as vice chair of the DNC. He joins us today to speak about the Trump administration's dangerous and disastrous first few months in power and what Democrats are going to do to save our economy, save our Constitution, save our democracy, and save our future. Hi, Malcolm. Welcome to The Signal.
I'm so happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, first, congratulations on your new role as Democratic Party National Committee Vice Chair.
Well, thank you so much. Listen, I'm also taking condolences on my free time, but I appreciate it.
So we're rapidly approaching Trump's first 100 days, and as we're recording this, we are 85 days in. What's your assessment of what the president and Republican majorities in the House and Senate, not to mention the phantom government agency DOGE, run by Elon Musk, have accomplished so far?
Yeah, it's felt like a hundred years, and it's only been 85 days, and he's spent every single day trying to eradicate our Constitution and our checks and balances, putting us in a position where folks are hardened around the idea that government doesn't work or can't work, and he proves every day, intentionally, that you shouldn't trust him or the agencies that he is that he's running. And what I mean by that is, for a long time, and even Doge, right, the entire frame of it is that government is so corrupt and inefficient, and then they spend every day being corrupt and inefficient. There is nothing efficient about cutting Medicaid and Medicare. What that does beyond ripping away a program that we all know. Here in Pennsylvania, we call it Penny, and other states they call it a variety of different names. But what that does, obviously, is just very big picture, rip away an important program. But what it does from a cost and efficiency perspective is even worse, right? Because when people don't have access to preventative care, for example, if you are having an issue with your leg that you could fix by doing some physical therapy, that costs all of us collectively cheaper than if you have to show up to the emergency room where all of us foot the bill. That was a part of the reason, Democrats and advocates fought so long for Obamacare and to expand the Affordable Care Act. And included in that was an expansion of Medicare and Medicaid, because we understood that treating people before they get that cancer diagnosis or before they get that diabetes diagnosis was not only better for that individual person and for their families and for their community and for the job that they work at, but it was also better for our government costs in the long run. And so cutting those programs doesn't save us money, doesn't make government more efficient. In fact, it does the opposite. The same is true when we talk about what's being done right now with the chaos and corruption in our economy. Tariffs that are imposed in a haphazard way. These taxes, they're official economic names, import taxes. When done in the way that they're being done, not only do not work to fix the trade deficit or to reduce the inflow of fentanyl or whatever issue or justification the president is giving on any given day. In fact, what it does is raise prices for consumers on all the things from food to clothing to electronics to the cost of materials to build your new house. It raises all the costs for those things. And then it squeezes small businesses who already have small margins and locks them out of global markets that they're not going to be able to repair just because Donald Trump tweets something different than he tweeted the day before. I was reading an article about a toy manufacturer in China who has effectively is moving away from working with business owners across the country because of the uncertainty with the tariff regime. And so everything from the Nintendo Switch, which a lot of people, myself included, were waiting for, is now being delayed. The cost of the clothes that we buy is going to go through the roof. And because of the way that he's doing it, not doing it in a collaborative way with our allies to try to deal with critical national security areas like steel, for example, or aluminum. We're doing it in a silo. We're doing it in isolation. And all it does is hurt America, and it doesn't put any other country in a position to actually negotiate a better deal for us on any host of issue. It actually pushes our allies into the arms of the people we shouldn't like. I'll end with this point, and I'm going into some detail because I know the people who are listening to this are smart, they can handle it. Because of the mass tariffs that the president announced, you have South Korea, Japan, and China working together to see how they can create an economic balance against our unfair trade practices that we're seeing from this president. Now, if anybody, just go and quickly Google the history of China, South Korea, and Japan. And so to have those three countries working together, South Korea and Japan, who are key allies to America, working with one of our key competitors, China, in the world. We are pushing our allies into the arms of our adversaries while raising costs for the American people. And so whether it's making government more efficient and cutting costs for the American taxpayer, they're not doing that. Whether it's actually lowering costs for the American people and being treated more fairly in the global trade economy, he's not doing that. And so on issue after issue after issue, it's clear to me that we've spent 85 days of this guy making us weaker, more isolated, and poorer as a country and as individual families.
Yeah, I mean, to Trump's credit, I think he's kind of seized, and this goes back to the first time he ran. He seized on popular dissatisfaction with trade and globalization, to capture certain working class voters. And unfortunately, if you go back to the history of kind of trade and free trade in particular, it's kind of been a bipartisan disaster. So I think like what you're doing is right. Like I think the Democratic Party, they need a more progressive populist kind of platform to address these structural imbalances within the global economy to counter, Trump's just kind of often xenophobic, right? And racist. He's blaming Mexicans for taking jobs when it's like the corporate CEOs who are outsourcing them, constantly looking for, the countries with the lowest wages and weakest environmental laws. So the Democratic Party, I think, has an opening there to, again, just kind of put forward a more progressive vision for a globalization that's sustainable, that's economically just, and that just kind of lifts all boats. But right now, you were talking a lot about the mistakes of the first 85 days of the Trump administration. Polls that have come out for the last month or so have shown that Trump's approval rating hovers between 41 and 46%, which is pretty low for a president in his first 2.5 months in office. And his approval ratings or disapproval ratings between 52 and 58%. So for Democrats, or just people who want to preserve however imperfect our multiracial and inclusive democracy is, this is good news. There is hope. But there's bad news too. And that's that the Democratic Party's approval ratings, they're a little lower right now. And your party is the only vehicle we have to save the country. But it seems like you guys aren't running, full speed ahead. You might have a flat tire on that vehicle. What's going on? Why are we seeing on the one hand buyer's remorse with Trump and his policies, but on the other, public dissatisfaction with the Democratic Party, with its messaging and actions, or maybe in some cases, inaction? What's the disconnect? And how are you and your colleagues going to fix that?
Listen, I didn't run to be vice chair of our party because I thought everything was going great. If you think everything's going great, then you just stick with the status quo. I ran because I thought things needed to change. I want to respond to a couple of things that you said in part. by asking some rhetorical questions that I want folks to sit with. Today we're talking on tax day. And today, millions of Americans, myself included, I have a stack of paper here, Cyril, that as soon as I get off with you, I'm going to finish going through, are going to file our taxes. Do we think that it makes America stronger, that it makes things better in our country to charge you, Cyril, $4,000, $5,000 more in taxes every year, and then use those additional payments that you make to subsidize another tax break for Elon Musk and for Jeff Bezos and for Tim Cook? Do we think it's fair that a millionaire is literally paying a lower percentage than the average teacher who you drop your kid off with every day? Do we think it's right that folks who run these huge multinational companies, who I didn't mention, who are raking it in hand over fist, giving $1 million donations to Donald Trump, who come to the Oval Office on the same day where we saw the largest drop to people's 401k savings, and said to the assembled millionaires and billionaires in the room, ha ha ha, look at how much money you made today? Do you think that that's an economic agenda that makes life better for working people? And I think for folks who are listening, they know the answer to that is fuck no. No. And what we need, and you said it absolutely right, is a Democratic Party that's ready to meet this moment. A Democratic Party leadership that is not just angry, but that understands the stakes. And the stakes are made manifest every single day. As we're sitting here right now, there's probably another person being ripped off the street by plainclothes people, sending them to a hellscape in El Salvador. I just read before I got on with you, a 19-year-old boy ripped coming out of his front door. He wasn't even the person they were trying to get. And the agents reportedly said, grab him anyway. And now that 19-year-old who has committed no crime is in prison in a foreign country without any due process. What that does may not sound like that has an economic connection, but people should understand what has made America great is not just that we've had a lot of money, which we have, not just that we've had, the strongest and most impressive fighting force in the world, which we have. It's also that America is a place that operates on the rule of law. It's a reason that America is the place that around the world, companies who have multinational disputes say, we want to come to America to have that case heard, because we trust that in America there's rule of law. And so when the president rips people off of the street, you might say, well, I don't know that person. And, you might hear, oh, well, that person shouldn't have been here, or whatever excuse they use. But in this country, when somebody breaks the law, we don't just snatch them up and throw them away. We bring them before their peers. When somebody commits a crime, it's the people versus that person. And we have an opportunity as citizens to know the harm that this person inflicted on us, and then to make a decision collectively, a jury of our peers, about how to enforce our laws. And when you lose that, it makes us a place that cannot be trusted around the world. And when you lose that trust around the world, it raises the costs for everything that Americans buy. The dollar is the reserve currency, in part because of this point that I made about courts, right? All these things sound like, how are these things connected? But in part of the reason the dollar is the reserve currency is because people trust us. And what Donald Trump is doing every day is shredding the trust that our neighbors have around the world, but also shredding the protections that we have to have as that we deserve, and that's in our Constitution, as the American people. The right to a fair and speedy trial, the right to confront your accuser, the right to not be absconded by the government because you tweet something that the president doesn't like. And so the Democratic Party has to talk about all of those things. We have to, yes, talk about the price of eggs, but we have to also talk about the fact that they are shredding our Constitution. Also talk about the fact that tariffs and the lack of due process, what that means in this interconnected way, with the price that you pay at the grocery store. All these things are interconnected. And so as the Democratic Party, we have a tough job. Because this guy spends every single day lying, making shit up, and breaking every law that he can find. And so it means that we spend every single day trying to respond to 1,000 different things. But the thing that gives me a lot of hope is that people across this country are waking up to the fact that our foundational document, the Constitution, which changed the course of human history, starts with 3 words: we the people. Not them, the billionaires, not them, the corporations. And I will say a little self deprecatingly, not us, the politicians, we, the people. The most important job in our democracy is the job of citizen. And the way that the Democratic Party has to be pushing back is about supporting, engaging with, and leading the mass mobilization that you're seeing across the country. And you're seeing it in part with the town halls that we're doing. We have conducted, as we sit here today, I think 39 or 40 town halls in 3 weeks. The turnout of them has been massive. We've seen Bernie and AOC also hosting their own, town halls all across the country, and members of Congress. I saw Maxwell Frost and others, supporting those events as well. That's really important for people to make their voices heard in a mass way. We also, as a party, have to continue to litigate. We have to make sure that when this guy breaks the law, we don't just say, oh, well, he's going to break the law. It's critical that we take his ass to court. And frankly, we are winning. And a part of the challenge right now is getting Republicans in Congress to not allow this president to ignore court orders, because Congress is the other branch that has to rein him in. And Republicans are in control of Congress. And as Americans, we should be saying that this is not Democratic or Republican. Americans across the political spectrum, including a supermajority of Republicans, believe that folks ought to respect and abide by court decisions. And it is going to require all of us to speak up right now through our mass mobilization to say to Republicans right now, we can't wait for another election. You need to hold this guy accountable right now. And then the final thing is we have to win elections. But the Democratic Party has, for too long, treated ourselves as if we only exist to elect the president every 4 years. Wrong, wrong. We have to start by putting our eye back on the ball of what's happening locally. Because again, as I talk about things being interconnected, the fact that Democrats in the Obama years, for example, lost state house after state house after state house. I mean, it was a wipeout of state chambers that used to either be tied or Democratic controlled that we lost. What was the impact of that? Republicans went in and gerrymandered congressional maps at the state legislative level, went and then gerrymandered congressional maps, putting us in a position that even when a majority of Democrats vote in a certain state or in a certain jurisdiction, Republicans can so gerrymander the map that they never lose, even if voters show up at record numbers, as we've seen in places like Louisiana or North Carolina, or Wisconsin, for example. And that's why the Democratic Party, investing as we did, 6 figures into a Supreme Court race in an odd year in Wisconsin. Yes, that matters for the people of Wisconsin on a variety of different things, from healthcare to childcare to union rights, for the people of Wisconsin and making sure that their constitution is enforced. But it also matters for all of us across the country in terms of the Wisconsin Supreme Court taking up a case that is going to come before them to overturn the gerrymandered maps in Wisconsin. And if we have fair maps, there are many experts who say that's at least 2 more Democratic congressional seats that we would pick up. Those seats would have put us in a position where the SAVE Act, which is trying to undermine the right of women and people to vote across this country, that wouldn't have passed if those 2 members of Congress had been Democratic members, and as opposed to the 2 Republican gerrymandered members that we have right now. The same is true for the budget framework, which they passed with very narrow margins. That wouldn't have been able to pass if what happened in Wisconsin had happened sooner. And so as a party, we recognize we have to do 1,000 things at once. We have to engage in mass mobilization. We have to litigate all of his crimes. And then also we have to keep our eye on elections up and down the ballot.
Say what you will about Trump and his coalition of oligarchs, Christian nationalists, libertarians and fellow travelers on the reactionary right, but they're seizing history and they're writing a new chapter in the story of America. They had a vision and a blueprint for carrying this out. It was called Project 2025. And they're successfully transforming America as a result and for the worst, rolling back the hard fought progress that we've made in the 20th century. What is the vision for America that the Democratic Party is championing? And what is the Democratic Party's story for America's future that can capture the popular imagination of a broad, multiracial and inclusive coalition? And do you think it's maybe worth having a counter document for all to see?
I love that you answer this question, because one of the things that that you asked this question, because one of the things that I'm fond of saying is that a fight fails without a dream. Here's what I think is important as I answer your question to state for folks who are listening. I am not a Democrat because I hate Republicans. I'm not even a Democrat because I don't like Donald Trump. To be crystal clear on this point, when I got registered to vote as a Democrat, the only thing I knew about Donald Trump was that he had a cameo in Home Alone 2 in the department store, okay? That's all I knew about that guy. I got registered as a Democrat because I grew up in a working poor family in North Philly. Buried both of my parents by the time I was 27 because they didn't have access to the type of health care everybody deserves. Moved around a bunch of times, but always had somewhere to lay our head because of the social safety net that was provided for us in terms of the housing choice voucher and access to affordable housing. Didn't have a lot, but had health care because of a little program called CHIP. Didn't have a school that had everything that we needed, but went to a good public school where PFT members, who were my teachers, went into their pockets and purses to make sure we had what we need. And what I understand is that the Democratic Party is the only hope, a strong Democratic Party, a Democratic Party that's not afraid to fight, a Democratic Party that is willing to stand up for our Constitution, for our values, is the only hope for working class families like mine. Here's what I believe in the country that I'm fighting for. I believe that you should have one good family sustaining job backed up by a union. That job should afford you the ability to buy a home in a community that's safe because other people around you have good family sustaining jobs as well. That along the course of your life, as you build and expand your family, if you get sick, that you can go to the damn doctor and then be able to afford the prescription when you leave the appointment. And if you choose to start a family or to expand a family, that kid that lives in that home in that safe neighborhood ought to have the ability to go to a good, fully funded public school where they're given all the tools to follow their dreams, to open that business, to go get their own family sustaining job. And that when you're lucky enough to watch them walk across that graduation stage or go into their career, that then you get to retire with a level of dignity and decency in the home that you built. That's the party that we're trying to build. That's the future that we're fighting for. And a part of how we get there is by saying that in America, everybody plays by the same rules and everybody pays their fair share. So that means an economic policy where millionaires and billionaires don't pay less, than that teacher that educated your kid. It means a 21st century investment in building housing across this country, expanding the housing stock and lowering the costs for people to get into that first home so you can get your little cornerstone of the American dream. It means expanding investments in things like CDFIs, which put people in a position who have a good idea, want to start a business, to get access to the capital that they need, which is so often out of reach for people across the racial spectrum who are from certain communities, and certainly for women, for veterans, for people of color who find it more difficult to get loans from the big banks. CDFIs are a real lifeline for them to start those small businesses. Why is that critical? Because small businesses account for 90+% of all employment in this country. And we know that when somebody builds a business in their community, they create a life cycle that supports that vision that I'm talking about. And so that's what we're fighting for: a fair tax policy, expanding the ability for folks to buy a home, to build homes in the first place, fighting for safe communities, and treating people with dignity and respect, particularly when it's their time to retire. And then beyond everything that I mentioned, then the government should leave you the fuck alone to live your life. We should make sure you have food on the kitchen table, but the government shouldn't get to decide what you talk about at the kitchen table, or who sits where at the kitchen table, or how many kids you have, or whether you have kids. Those are the things that we need to get out of and allow people to live a life that is free, that is full, and that is safe. That's what we're fighting for every
And
single
so,
day.
I mean, I don't want to belabor this point because I don't necessarily think it's that important. But would it be worth putting all of this down on paper for like a progressive Project 2029, or do you think that's not necessarily what you guys need?
Listen, I think what's going to be important in the next couple of years here, as from the perspective of the party, is we need to make sure that we have the fairest, most open nominating process in history for the folks who are going to run for president. And every single day, you hear about another person who's going to throw their name in. And I'm excited for this country to see the incredible depth and bench of our party. And so we're going to make sure that we do that. And I think that, frankly, we need to allow our candidates who are informed by the people who elect them to tell us what the vision is. What we have as Democrats, what we should have are shared values, and then people have specific ways of executing those values based on where they live. If you live in Florida, right now, the cost of insurance because of the impact of climate change, which we need to double down on addressing, that may be the number one issue for you. That might not be the same, in Wisconsin, right? But all of that fits neatly into this idea that you ought to have a home that you can afford in a neighborhood that's safe. And your house is not safe if you can't live there because we're not addressing the extreme weather events that are getting worse every single season. And so I think that at the end of the day, our voters are telling us, what they want, and I think what they want is a party that fights hard against Donald Trump, and we are going to do that at the ballot box and in the courthouse. A party that has a fair process to pick our nominee, and we're going to have a fair process where voters get to vet candidates and vote for the person they want. And also, we have to engage in and support people-centered, people-driven mass mobilization that's happening all across this country. It's why you saw members of the leadership team all across the country on April 5th engaging in those protests. And I know there are protests happening on April 19th, and you'll see folks all across the country, engage with those. And you'll see us continue to host our town halls across this country so we can hear, from people. But I do want to just say this as I close. It's really important, I think, to not give Donald Trump too much credit either. Yes, Project 2025 was a vision to raise costs on people and make life miserable for working people and working families. But we should also be clear that as cruel as these people are, they're also pretty stupid. Now, I don't want to say that because they're stupid, they're not dangerous. In fact, cruelty and stupidity combined are the most dangerous forces. But we should be clear that because he is so stupid, because he is so cruel, he's not addressing the needs of the American people. And what the American people said is they wanted a presidency that was focused on lowering costs for them. They're not. And so what does that mean? It meant that for the first time since Donald Trump has been a figure in public life, his numbers on the economy are underwater for the first time ever. More people have a dim view of his economic stewardship than they've ever had before. That's important. And right before you came on, I saw a poll from Morning Consult that showed for the first time in, I believe, years, I don't want to say how far back because I don't want to be incorrect, but it shows that Democrats writ large, the American people, have a stronger opinion toward Democrats stewarding the economy over Republicans, which is usually the converse. And you know this as somebody who is a reporter. Almost always people, usually by small margins, but say they, support Republicans' economic vision over Democrats. But I think the American people are starting to understand that if you want a strong economy, you want strong unions. If you want a strong economy, you want a housing stock that helps to lower costs and to deal with the crisis of housing. If you want a strong economy, you want a thoughtful trade policy that doesn't tariff Penguin Island, but that actually focuses on tariffs on things like aluminum and steel and creates fairness across the board. And if you want a strong economy, you have to be a place that has the rule of law. And so the American people are waking up to that, I think. And I think it's in no small part because of the conversations that we've been having in red districts, frankly, all across this country.
And finally, what advice can you give folks about what they can do at the local and state level?
I'm so happy you closed with that question because I actually think it's the most important question. I make this point repeatedly, and I'm going to make it again today. Just because you cannot do everything doesn't mean you can't do something. And when we look at any movement, you think about a movement that has expanded the promise of this country, the movement for led by suffragettes to get the right to vote and fully participate as women in this country, the movement for civil rights and voting rights, the movement for labor rights. There is a reason that would-be dictators and fascists try to go after history because they want us to forget how those movements actually happened. And it's easy in retrospect to pick a couple of leaders who gave, important speeches or critical interviews or who sponsored important legislation. But the reality is all of those movements were made up of hundreds of thousands, millions of people, so many of whom their names and what they did is lost to history and time, but it wouldn't have been possible without them. I make the point because it's the 60th anniversary of the Bloody Sunday and the Edmund Pettus Bridge and all the rallies and marches that came after. Many people, if you ask about Bloody Sunday, they remember the icon, the legend, John Lewis. They may remember some others who were there that day. But I often make the point that there were over 600 people on the bridge that day, dentists and lawyers and homemakers who gave up everything, not because they knew the outcome. They didn't know the outcome. All they knew was at the end of that bridge were state troopers armed to the teeth with dogs and water hoses and bullhorns telling them to leave. That's all they knew was on the other side of that. So they didn't show up because they were guaranteed an outcome. They showed up because they knew it was something worth fighting for. And in this moment, the question is there somebody in your life who you think is worth fighting for? And if you do, then fight like their life is on the line. Fight like their economic security is on the line. Fight like their future is on the line, because it is. And so when you show up or you make the 5 calls or you donate a couple of bucks to, a candidate or to the party of your choice, whatever that is, that all cumulatively matters. And it's the only thing that's going to move the needle. But I would encourage folks to also call Republicans as well, to hold them accountable as well, particularly in places like Bucks County. Brian Fitzpatrick comes home and pretends to be a moderate, plays one on TV, on local news. And then he goes to DC and votes for all this nonsense while pretending to be a thoughtful voice. Why has he said nothing? A former FBI agent said nothing about the extrajudicial kidnappings of people who've committed no crime. Why has he said nothing about Donald Trump laughing while people lose their 401ks and slapping billionaires on their backs? Why has he said nothing about this guy ignoring our courts and ignoring Congress? So we have to make sure we're holding people accountable and holding this party accountable as well to ensuring the vision that I talked about, where you have one good job backed up by a union and a house that you can afford and a neighborhood that's safe with a kid that can go to a good public school, and then you can retire with a level of dignity and decency. That is what's on the line, and all of us have to do our part to fight for it.
Well, Malcolm, thanks so much for coming on, and thanks for all the work you're doing to help steer the Democratic Party and to save democracy, and I hope you'll come back again.
Anytime. Thank you so much for your time and for everything that you do, my friend.
This has been The Signal, a podcast by the Bucks County Beacon. I'm Cyril Migaleko, editor-in-chief and host. For more progressive news, analysis, and opinion from Bucks County and beyond, go to www.buckscountybeacon.com.